chase.
Thanks, Andrew. Speaking to a joint session of the West Virginia Senate and House of Delegates, the governor celebrated achievements and progress the state saw over the last year. That includes billions of dollars of private sector investment in energy and new businesses and substantial federal funding brought in for broadband expansion and rural health transformation. Looking ahead, the governor shared some of his goals and priorities for the 2026 session of the West Virginia legislature, which started today at noon. The governor is asking the legislature for a 3% pay raise for state employees.
These state employees, they're working hard. They're teaching our kids. They're fixing our roads and bridges. They're guarding our prisons. And they're policing our streets. They show up every day to serve others, often putting the needs of their communities ahead of their own. They've all earned a pay raise.
The governor is also asking lawmakers to put $6 million into improving state child protective services facilities and $20 million into state parks. I'll have more on the governor's address at 11 tonight, but that's all for now. Thanks, Andrew. Back to you.